Welcome to Module 2, Custom NetSuite Pages. In this module, we're going to continue on with our discussion from the previous module and look at creating custom NetSuite pages in a little bit more detail. By the end of this module, we should be able to recognize the different uses of Suitelets, not just for displaying form pages, but also for things like displaying lists on your NetSuite page, or if you want to create a wizard that would allow the user to step through the code. You should also be able to describe the different components that are used when creating UI Suitelets, as well as be able to create a Suitelet with different kinds of fields other than the ones that we have used in the previous module. We're also going to look at changing the different properties. Maybe you want to set that as hidden, or maybe you want to change a particular field so that it's mandatory. And we're also going to explore the different layouts that are available for Suitelets. Another thing that you should be able to do is to understand or identify how information gets transferred to your Suitelet, how your Suitelet handles that information, and how the Suitelet passes the information back to the browser or to the client. Lastly, you should be able to attach a client-side script to a Suitelet or understand how that's done. Now, before we start talking about how we create a Suitelet, let's first understand what Suitelet scripts are. Suitelets run on the idea that information that is passed to the script and information passed back to the client can be processed directly on the script. Now, for other script types, what happens is that the information is passed to the system and the system processes that information before passing that to the script. With a Suitelet, the request or the information passed directly from the client is handled by the script directly. And with the processing, the script can do whatever it wants to do and push that information back to the client. That gives a Suitelet script the flexibility to control what kind of information is going to be displayed on your browser page. There are different kinds of pages that you can create using a Suitelet. One thing that we've already seen would be creating a custom NetSuite form. Another thing that you can create would be a custom list page, which would be similar to your Save Search, but it allows you to create your custom list of records that you would be displaying. So we're going to explore that in a bit. You can also create assistant pages. Assistant pages are basically wizard pages that allows your users to step through a specific process instead of being bombarded with hundreds of fields on one single NetSuite form. Other than that, you can also create custom HTML pages, and these are pages that are completely designed by you. That means that the whole HTML code, including the design, for example, if you have your own CSS, would be controlled by you. So that's something that we're going to explore in a future module. Aside from displaying information on the page, you can also use a Suitelet as a form of a web service where you can transfer information through the wire without having to display that on the page. For example, if you want to send information in an XML data format, that's something that you can do. You're not limited to using XML. You can use any text-based format. For example, if you want to use JSON, if the other application that you're using would prefer to input JSON format data so that it can be processed easier, that's something that you can do with a Suitelet. Or general web services. So anytime you want to transfer information from one part of your system to a client, you can use a Suitelet. So you're not limited to just changing the NetSuite user interface, but you can also use that as a backend or as a web service for transferring information. But in this course, we are going to look at creating a custom user interface. So we're going to concentrate on how we can display our own design on a NetSuite page. Let's try to look at the different custom page components that we will be using to create our own design for your NetSuite page. So there are 4 different objects or 4 different information that we are going to manage for our custom component or for our custom page. That would be our page type, and we're going to look at the member objects. And then for our member objects, there are 2 things that we can change there, and that would be your member properties, which is how a field is displayed or how an element is displayed. And we're also going to look at the page layout so that we can change the look and feel of our page. Let's start with the custom page types. Like what I've mentioned earlier, there are three different kinds of pages that you can use for NetSuite. So you can use a form page, something that we've seen in the previous module. You can also use a list page. So as you can see, a list page is very similar to, say, a saved search result where you can see a list of records. And you can also have assistant pages. And as you can see from the screenshot, we have different steps that the user can go through. So again, we already have seen a form page, and that will be used if you want to allow your user to type information in and process that information that the user has entered on the form. You can also use that to display information similar to opening a record in view mode. So let's say you want to combine different information from different records, which is something that you may not be able to do with a standard record. But with a SuiteLit, since it's not attached to a particular record, you can actually pull information from different sources and then put that in one page instead of just having your user to move from one record type to another. Another page type that we have would be a list page. So a list page would be used if you want to display a list of records that the user can either just view or go to if you want to link to a particular record. How a custom list is different from, say, a saved search is that a custom list page or a custom SuiteLit list allows you to use multiple sources similar to your form page. So if you're creating, say, an employee saved search, the information that you would see on the list would all be employee records. Or if you're creating a transaction search, all of the information that would be listed would be transaction records. With a custom list page, you can combine information, so you can have a combination of employee records and transaction records all in one list. So that allows your users to look at the information without having to go through multiple save searches and basically just combine that information for easy viewing. Now, the last page type that we have here would be the assistant pages. And assistant pages are quite underused but powerful because it allows you to focus on certain things on your page instead of just displaying everything in one single form. Just imagine if you are a new user of NetSuite and you are brought to a form where that form has 100 different fields that you have to populate. That can potentially be overwhelming. But if you are going to use an assistant page, what you can do as a developer is that you can create, say, 10 steps or 10 pages on your assistant pages, then have your user just go from one step to another step, and the user would only be seeing 10 fields at a time. So this would be less overwhelming for the user, and this would be very user-friendly. Assistant pages can also be very helpful if you want to deal with certain steps. For example, they need to populate information at a certain order so that they can process the information once it goes to the next page. So whatever information maybe that they use for the first step would be used to determine what's going to appear on the next step. So if that's something that you want to do, you can definitely use assistant pages for that. So again, form pages if you want to allow your user to just type in information or display information on the page. List page if you want to display multiple records on a particular page. And assistant pages if you want to break down your page into multiple steps or allow your users to go through a certain order for your processing. Once you have determined what kind of form you're going to use, or what kind of page type you're going to use, the next thing that you will be thinking about would be what kind of elements you're going to add on your page, and those would be your member objects. In terms of member objects, if we try to compare that with standard HTML, if you look at this source code for standard HTML, you can see that there are a lot of things that you have to consider for the design. For example, of course, one, you need to look at what kind of form elements you're going to add. Are you going to add a button? Are you going to add a text field? Are you going to add a radio button or whatever? Also, you're going to think about the formatting. Are you going to use a certain color scheme for these buttons? And each element, you have to make sure you format that. Now, the easier way of doing that, of course, is by using CSS. but that still means that you have to format each element. And if you forgot to format a particular element or apply a certain CSS style, then your page would not display properly. You're also going to look at the form layout. So how are you going to display everything on the page? Do you put that 1 pixel to the left, 10 pixels to the right, or those things are something that you have to consider if you're dealing with HTML. And you're going to also add additional validation. Let's say you want to add a text field. You want to make sure that you write JavaScript on the back end to make sure that that proper text field is validated. Let's say if you're going to use an email, you want to make sure that your users would be following a certain email format. Now, that is if you are using traditional HTML. If you are going to use SuiteScript UI, then makes it really, really easy to change everything. Because if you look at the code for creating UI pages, you can see here that creating the elements would be very simple because all you need to do to create the page is to use the create form method of the server widget module. And that creates everything for you. All of the design that you would be doing manually on an HTML page would already be handled by the system. So formatting would already be there. Layout would already be there. Even the field validation that you have to write a JavaScript for would already be handled by the system. So for example, if you add a field, so you can see I have an add field method here, which I'm adding a text field. But if I decide to add an email field, validation for that email, if they write down an invalid email format, that would already be handled by the system. You don't need to write a single piece of code. So the long code that we saw earlier on the previous slide, where we have an HTML page with all of the JavaScript attached and formatting attached, would be equivalent to these 3 lines where you would be just creating a field and adding 2 fields on the system. And then again, everything would be handled by NetSuite and be displayed properly without having to worry about anything in terms of design. But that doesn't mean that you cannot change how your form looks like. And that's why you're probably attending this course. You want to make sure you know how you can change the custom UI so that it would fit your needs. Modifying the UI object properties allows you to control how your field behaves or how the element behaves and how it looks like on the page. Now, if you want to change the UI properties, there are 3 different ways of doing that. First, you can use the constructor method when you are creating a particular object. So here in our example, we can see that we want to add a submit button on the form, and we are changing the property by changing the label to update record through its constructor object. Now, if you've already created the object, you can still use methods that are attached to that created object to change its properties. For example, here I've already created a field called name, and what I'm trying to do is that I want to change the display property so that the users would not be able to change information on that field and set that to inline. So by setting the field to inline, the information is displayed on the page but cannot be modified on a regular field. Now, other than the object method, you also have properties that are built into our field objects, such as the isMandatory property. So for the isMandatory property, if you want to make a field mandatory to make sure that the user would be typing information in that field before submitting, then you can just set that mandatory to true. And again, everything that you would see on a standard NetSuite page would already be managed by the system. For example, if I set a field is mandatory to true, all of the things that are happening in the background, such as adding that gold star or adding that pop-up message to tell the user that this particular field is mandatory, that is automatically added by the system just by setting that property. So you can see that it's very easy for you to build a custom NetSuite page. Lastly here, aside from the object properties, you also have some page layout options. And the page layout option is very easy to understand, except that users don't really look at the documentation much to discover that you can actually change how your page is displayed on the form. There are 2 different things that you would be looking at if you are going to create your page. For the layout, you would be looking at the columns. So you can see that the fields would be displayed as columns. And you also have sections for the outside of the column. So you have two sections for outside. You have the outside above, and you also have outside below. So you can change your page layout so that it would display where you want it to be displayed. Typically, what happens is that if you add a field to the page, the layout is controlled automatically by the system, and it would flow from one column to another column so that it is visually balanced. So that's something that is controlled automatically by the system. The system would add an additional column if necessary if you add a field and that field is not visually balanced. Now, if you want to have control over where the field would display, let's say, okay, I want to only display one field on the first column. So that would just be like a main field that they need to enable or disable. And then all of the other fields, let's say 5 or 6 fields, would be on the second column. So that means it's not visually balanced because you only have one field on the first column and then 5 fields on the second column. You can actually set the value for the start call. So that's the property that you need to set. And once you set the start call, that means that, okay, for this particular field, I'm going to move that and then use that as my starting field for the next column. So that forces the system to say, okay, for the first field, that's still normal. It displays on the first field. But for the second field, I want that as my starting column for the next column. So that means that everything else would be placed after that second field. But if you are going to use the start column property, that would disable the automatic reflow, meaning if you want your page to be visually balanced, you have to balance that yourself. That means that you have to control where the field would go, if it's going to stick to the first column or go to the second column, or maybe just use a third or a fourth column if necessary. Aside from our columns, you also have your rows. So you have an option to put that above the column, so that's outside above, or you can put that below your columns, which is outside below. It's up to you. So if you want to have very important information like notes or any kind of notification that the user need to read first before populating the information on the form, then you might want to put that outside above. Or if you want to just have, maybe just add a footnote, it's still important, but it's not as important as your main message, then maybe you can put that at outside below. So if you are going to use that, what's going to happen is similar to your columns where the system would automatically handle if it's going to go to the first row, the second row, or the third row. So again, everything would be visually balanced by the system so that it would look pretty on your page, basically. But if you want to control how that displays, you can use the start row. So instead of just having the system control where your elements would be added, it would actually be controlled by you. So maybe you want to move certain elements on the second row or on the third row. Again, that is up to you. So those are different options. So you have your outside options, the outside above or outside below, and you also have your columns, which is where all of your fields are regularly placed. Now let's try to look at this in detail by creating or finishing up the form that we have created in the previous module. So what we want to do here is that we're going to look at the different form objects on our page, and then we're going to modify the different field properties so that we can change how the field displays. We're also going to look at the different layout options so that we can see how our page can be controlled by just changing the layout options. So let's go ahead and go to our walkthrough. Before we start modifying our code, let's take a look at the current state of our customer onboarding SuiteLit. So if you remember from the previous module, we created a SuiteLit where we added a few field groups and fields to our SuiteLit. So the point of our customer onboarding page is that we want to be able to perform certain processes when we create a new customer. So here you can see we have a customer information field group with the customer name, the sales rep, and also the phone number. Right now it is empty because we're going to pull that information from our recently created customer. Aside from that, we have our task fields. So we have our task title and also some notes for our task. We will be using this to create a task record so that we can remind the sales rep to welcome our customer. Aside from that, we have a welcome email that we will be sending to our customer to welcome them to our company. Lastly, here we have a note at the bottom just to tell the customer or to tell the user that this is an important step of our customer onboarding process. So let's go ahead and go to our code here. And what we want to do is that we want to change how our field or our page displays. First off, what we want to do is that we want to change our note. So the note field here, we want to move that so that it's on the top instead of at the bottom. The way we created our code is that we've created our note field last. So that's why it's placed at the bottom of our page. So what we can do is that we can actually move that by just cutting the code and then pasting that at the top of our form. But we want to learn how we can modify our page by using layout options. So we're going to explore that a little bit. Also, we want to make sure that our customer name, sales rep information, and phone number fields are not editable. So we're going to change that to either disabled or inline. And we're going to look at what those two does to our page and what's the difference between the two. Other things that we want to change, maybe we want to change our body field to make it a little bit larger. So right now we are using the text area field for task notes and also for the body, which is slightly larger than your regular text field. So for that text area, for the body of the email, we want that a little bit larger because it's an email field and we want to see everything that we have typed in. Lastly, we want to change the fields that are important to our process, which is the task fields and also the email fields, and make that mandatory. So let's go ahead and go to our code here. And if you remember from our previous discussion, we mentioned that one way to change the property of a field or a component is to use the constructor. So here we have the add submit button, and if you don't put in any value on the add submit button, what will happen is that they'll give you a save label on that button, but we don't want to use save. So what we're going to do is that we're just going to change this to say complete process. Now let's go ahead and change the customer information fields, starting with our name field. So what we want to do with the name field is that we want to update the display type. So we have the update display type option here. And then for the update display type, I have a property called the display type. And all I need to do is just set that. So we have our enum value coming from our server widget module called the field display type. So for our field display type, we have several options. We have disabled, entry, hidden, inline, normal, and read only. What we're interested in using here would be disabled and inline, which prevents the user from modifying the value of a field. But again, what is the difference between disabled and inline? So to see the difference, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to set one field as disabled and I'm going to set the other fields as inline. Since we want to do this for our name field and also our phone number field and sales rep fields, I'm just going to copy that and then change the field objects here. So here that's our sales rep and this would be our phone field. There we go. And then just change this from disabled to inline. Same thing here, just set that to inline. Okay, there you go. And let's go ahead and continue this. And what we're going to do is that we're going to modify everything first, and then we're going to upload that and then try to render that on the page so that we can see the changes that we've made. What you can also do is that you can go ahead and modify your code, upload that and test to see if everything's okay. Then go back and then continue modifying. It's all a matter of preference. So next thing we're going to do is that we're going to modify our body field. So our body field is named EM body field. And like what I've said, I want to update the display size to make it a little bit larger. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to use the update display size method. So the update display size method has two properties, which is the height. And so here for the height, I'm going to set that to say 20 pixels. So that should be a good enough height. And then for the width, we want to make that a little bit larger. So I'm going to set that to say 85. Okay, so again, we're going to see what that looks like in a bit. Another thing that we want to change here is that we want to move the notes field. So if you remember here, the note field is at the bottom of our form. Again, I can just copy this and then, or cut this and then paste that at the top of the page. But we want to see how we can update the layout option. And I can do that. So I can just get my note field here and I can use the update layout type. So for the update layout type, I'm going to set the value here of the layout type. So just layout type. Then again, I'm going to get the value from my server widget module. I have a field layout type enum. And then I'm just going to say I want to put that outside above instead of at the bottom of the page, which is outside below. Okay, so we already modified three things here. We've modified one, the set of fields, to change that to either disabled or inline. Another modification here is by changing the size of the field. And then the last modification that we've made is to move our note field from the bottom of the page to the top of the page. Last set of modifications that we're going to do is that we're just going to make sure our our important fields are mandatory so that our users would not skip those fields and skip some of the important parts of our onboarding process. So here we have four fields that we want to modify. We want to modify our task field. So we have our task title field, and then we have a property called is mandatory. So that's another way of modifying a component just by setting that property. So here all we need to do is just set that to true. And since we have four fields that we want to modify, what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to copy that and then change the field reference. So I have my task notes here, which is the memo for my task. I have my subject that I want to change. So that's EM subject. And then lastly, I also want to change the body, which is EM body field. There we go. So let me go ahead and upload this to our server. Okay. There we go. I believe I have not. Okay, let me just re-authenticate my master password. Let me upload that. There you go. Okay, so that should upload in a bit. Okay, looks like it's done. Let me go back to my SuiteLit here and let me refresh my page. And if everything is okay, looks like we might have misspelled our add field. Let me just go back real quick here and look at the line number 91. Oh, add field. There you go. Let's go ahead and change that. Okay, let me upload that to our server. Oh, there you go. And let me refresh this. And yeah, looks like everything is okay here. So as you can see here, we have our customer name. So if you set a field as disabled, what's going to happen is that it's going to still display that field, but gray out that field to note that this cannot be edited. Now, the one thing that is different from a disabled field with an inline field is that it's still not editable, but you don't have that gray box. Okay, so an inline field actually displays better because it shows that we're just displaying that information. With a disabled field, that denotes that the field can potentially be modified, but right now the conditions are not met for you to be able to modify that particular field. Now, in our case, we can never modify our customer name field. So that means that we shouldn't really be using disabled. Instead, we should be using inline because again, inline displays better if you are only showing information and you're not allowing the user to modify the field. Now, another thing that we modified here is our body field. So for our body field, it is a little bit bigger now, which is perfect for sending an email because we can see more information on the body field. And then another thing here, before we forget, we have our small note here, which used to be at the bottom of our page, but now it's at the top of the page because we have changed the layout option so that it's outside above instead of outside below. And then lastly, we have our mandatory option. So we have set our 4 fields, the task title, the notes, the subject, and also the body as mandatory. And you know that it's mandatory because you can see that gold star beside our field. And since this is mandatory, all of the options that are available for checking if the field's populated is there. So if I click on complete process here, you can see here that I have an error saying that, okay, you have missed some of the mandatory fields. Please make sure that you set the title, the notes, the subject, and the body before continuing. So this would not submit the form unless you populate the fields. Okay, so if I try to populate that, I'll just add in some gibberish here. It's not important at this point because we don't have any processing in the background. If I click on complete process, it will submit the information, but since we're not really capturing the information yet, we can see that it's not really doing anything, but it's just refreshing the page. Okay. So that's it. So if you want to modify your components, what you need to do is you can either use the constructor, as you can see from our add submit button, or you can use your field methods such as the update display type or the update display size or the update layout options. Or what you can also do is that you can set the properties that are related to the user interface, such as setting a field as mandatory. So in this case, all we need to do is just set the value to true and the field would be mandatory. By default, all fields would be optional. So if you want to set this as optional, you don't need to set this as false. Just go ahead and remove that definition and that field would go back or revert to being optional. So that's it for this walkthrough, and let's go ahead and continue with the module. At this point, we have seen how easy it is to create a custom user interface in NetSuite. What we haven't seen yet is how can we actually process information from our requests to our SuiteLet. So here we're going to see how data is handled by capturing the information from the request and then processing that and then displaying another set of information on our page. Before we can start creating a code that would gather information from the request, it's important for us to understand the kinds of requests that we're going to get from our client. So here we can see that there are 2 kinds of requests, a GET request and a POST request. Now, what is the difference between a GET request and a POST request? The GET request typically would send information using a parameter embedded within the URL. And this is something that you would typically see on a normal web page where you have your URL and then you have a question mark at the end of the URL and a set of key value pairs to transfer information from our client to the server. So here we have an example of a NetSuite URL where we are mentioning that the account ID is 193 or that it is reloaded and the report type is register. Now, another kind of request that you would potentially get would be a POST request. Unlike a GET request where the information is embedded within the URL, a POST request is actually packaged within a form. So here we have an order form, and if we submit this order form, the information is packaged up and then sent to our server inside that HTTP packet. Now, what happens here is that you cannot see the information in the URL because that is being transferred in the background. Now, you might be thinking, is a POST request more secure than a GET request? Potentially, it can be because you can see that the information is not being displayed on the URL. But this doesn't mean that we should always use a post request. There are certain important uses for a GET request. Now for a GET request, since the information is embedded within the URL, that means that you can bookmark the information and still load that particular page with the information intact. Unlike with a post request, what will happen is that if you type in information, let's say you're on the order page, you complete the form, and then after you complete the form, you fail to submit it and decided that, or maybe you haven't completed it yet, but you have completed, say, 80% of all of the fields that you need to enter data into. So if you haven't really completed that, you decided to bookmark that page, close that page. If you load that page, you would have to start from scratch because the information is not saved. So what you need to do is that if you want to save information, you would have to use the GET request. Now, it's important for us to understand that difference because once you start loading information, you would need to determine if the information is coming from a GET request or if it's coming from a POST request. So let's try to see how that looks like in our code by going through a walkthrough. And what we're going to do in this walkthrough is that we're going to get URL parameter values from a requester. Now this requester would be coming from another script type. So this is coming from a user event script who will be throwing information at our Suitelet. So we're going to grab that information or catch that information from our user event script, use that information so that we can process the data on our Suitelet and complete our onboarding process. So let's go ahead and go to our walkthrough. What we're going to do now is that we're going to grab information from our recently created customer record and display that information on our customer onboarding page. We can do that by getting the information from another script. And if I go back to my IDE here, you can see that I have already created a user event script that will be deployed to our customer record. You can see here that the script would be running on after submit, which means that it will be grabbing the information when the customer has been or the customer record has been saved. You can also see here that I'm using two modules, the redirect module and also the record module, and we will be using that to grab the information from our customer record. Now going down to our after submit method, you can see that I'm grabbing the information from our context object so that we can get a reference to the record object for our customer. Now that we've gathered our customer record, we're going to use that to extract certain field information and pass that to our Suitelet. Another thing that we have here would be an if statement. So I have an if statement here checking for the contents that this particular code chunk would only get triggered if the user is creating a new record. Now this is important because we only want to trigger our script if the user is creating a new customer record. If the user is saving an existing customer record or a customer that may have been with us for several years, we don't want to send an onboarding email because this is not a new customer. Another thing that we have here would be a redirect method. So for that redirect method, we're redirecting specifically to our Suitelet. So you can see here that our script ID is 93, and we also have our deployment ID of 1 because, well, we only have one deployment record. What's important for us though would be this particular property, which is the parameters property. This property is used to transfer information from one script type to our Suitelet by using URL parameters. So you can see here that I'm getting information, for example, the customer ID. So I'm transferring that by getting the ID from our customer object that we've extracted from our context object. We also have our phone number, our email address, which we are going to use for processing, and then also the internal ID of our sales rep. So what happens or what's happening here is that we're gathering the information from our record object and then we're using these names for our parameter. So for the parameter names, unlike our field names, you don't need to start with cust page. You can use whatever parameter or URL parameter name that you want. One thing that you have to take note of is try to avoid parameters that are being used by NetSuite. For example, do not use name, do not use ID, and do not use anything that you might have seen on the URL. To make sure that you don't have any collisions, what you can do is that you can add in a 2 or 3 letter abbreviation of your organization. Now in this case, since we're pretending to be employees of SuiteDreams, I have prefixed my parameters with SDR. So once I go back to my Suitelet, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to grab all of these IDs and then use that to gather the information from our script. So I've already created the script, and I've also created our script record that would be getting that parameter values on our Suitelet. Okay, so let's see if this works. So let's go ahead and go to our form. Oh, by the way, before we do that, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to comment out our if statement. And the reason why I'm commenting out my if statement is that I don't want to keep creating new records just to test my script. I'm going to edit an existing record, then save that so that I can see if my after submit script has been triggered and if it's being redirected to my Suitelet. And that's the only goal that I have at this point. Once I know that my script is working, I can uncomment this so that I can make sure that the script would only get triggered when I'm creating a new customer record. So let's go ahead and go to our page and let me open a customer record. So it doesn't really matter which customer record we're going to use. Let's just use one of the first ones. Let's see ABC marketing here. I'm not even going to modify this. I'll just click on save. And if everything is working properly, it should redirect us to our onboarding page, which is correct. So as you can see here, we have been redirected to our customer onboarding Suitelet. Now, as you can see, we have transferred the information from our user event script to our Suitelet, but I'm not seeing the information. So I can see here customer name, sales rep, and phone number are still empty. So how do I know if the information was properly transferred? If you are transferring information from another script type, such as a user event script, to a Suitelet, that information would be transferred as a GET request. So how do I know that this is a GET request? If I go to my URL, I can actually see some of the some of the information that has been passed. For example, for the email address, we can see that maybe the email address was not set up as well as the phone number field, but we can see that the customer ID for ABC marketing is 325, and the sales rep is, oh, let me just go back here. I can see that the sales rep ID is assigned to -5, which is the currently logged in user. Okay, so I know that that's my internal ID. So anyway, so how do we process that information? So I'm going to my Suitelet. So here on my Suitelet, I'll just go all the way up top here, and I can grab that Suitelet information or that parameter information by getting that from our request. So here, I'm just going to create a variable for my customer ID. So customer ID here, so I can get that from my request, and inside my request object, I have a parameters object. So inside my parameters object, that's where I'm going to get the information that I have passed from my user event script. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to copy these parameters. And by the way, you can use a mixture of uppercase and lowercase letters for your parameters. So it is case sensitive though. So you have to make sure that if you use an uppercase letter, you have to use an uppercase letter on your parameters call. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to copy this. I'll just create 4 entries here. So I have my customer ID. So also for my phone number, and maybe I can just populate that later. I also have my email value and also my sales rep ID. And then go back to my customer field here. I'll just copy this to make sure I don't accidentally misspell anything. So for the request, just change that from customer ID to phone. I also have one here for my email, so I'll just copy that, paste that right over here, and then another one for my sales rep ID. Copy that and paste that right over here. Okay, so we have already gathered the information on our request. But even if we've gathered the information on our request, it's actually not going to do anything at this point. It's just grabbing the information and then putting that on our Suitelet. Now, the thing about a Suitelet is that you have the flexibility to create everything from scratch because you have a blank form object and you can add all of the fields. That also means that all of the configuration, including the default value or the value that you're going to set on the field, that's something that you have to explicitly mention on your code. If you don't add the code, that tells the user that, okay, I am, or it tells the script that I am setting a value on the field, it's not going to display that information even if you've already grabbed that from the URL. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm just going to scroll all the way down, and then at the bottom here, before I submit the information to the response, I'm just going to say, I'm going to get the name field, and then I'm going to set the default value, and then I'm going to set that to the customer ID. I'm also going to get my phone field, then again set the default value, set that to phone, and then lastly here I have my sales rep field, which is the field object. Set the default value to the sales rep ID. Okay, there we go. Let me just upload this. And again, if everything is working properly, if I go to my record, I'll just reuse the same record here. And I want to make sure I put in my email address. I'll just say abc@abc.com. For the phone number, I'll just say 555-5555. There you go. So let me click on save. After clicking on save, I'll click on OK. Oh, looks like I need to refresh the page first. Okay, there we go. I'm going to try that again. So abc@abc.com, then phone number 555-5555. Save. And again, if everything is all right, we should be able to see that information displayed on the form. Now, one thing here that you'd notice is that for the customer name, I've actually used the internal ID, and instead of displaying the name, it's actually displaying 325, which is not what I'm expecting to happen. And that is because I'm using a text box instead of a select field. For the sales rep, if you remember, this is actually a list or record field, or meaning a field that has a drop down. And since I've set that to my employee record with a particular internal ID, which is -5, what happened is that it actually gave me a link here instead of just displaying the name. And the good thing about that link is that I can go to that particular employee record. So if I click on my name here, it will actually get redirected to that employee record. So that's something that you might want to do if you're displaying a record information. So here, instead of displaying just the name of the customer, which I can get using the get value on my user event script, what I can do here is that I can just use a select field and then set that to inline so that I have that, convenience of just clicking on that link to redirect to my customer record. So let me quickly modify that. Let me look for my name field here. And then instead of using my text field, I'm going to use a select field, okay, which is a list or record field. And then also I'm going to change this. Instead of using disabled, if I use disabled, it's still going to display the name, but I really don't want to display the name. What I want to do is that I want to display the name and provide a link to my user. So I'm going to just change this to inline. Let me upload that real quick, and that's it. So if I go back to my page here, let me just go back to ABC Marketing. Let me refresh this again so that I can reload the information. Click Save, and let's see if that works. So as you can see, oh, I accidentally just set that. Oh, looks like what I'm going to do here is that I'm just going to change this name field. Instead of displaying that as a text field, I'm going to use a select field or a list or record field. Now, after changing from a text field to a list record field, I also need to add another property, which is the source property. What the source property does is that it tells the user, or it tells the system, which record will this internal ID be compared against. So here, since I am passing the internal ID, it's going to check, okay, this internal ID matches this particular customer, and once that customer record is loaded, it would be displayed as an information on that particular field. If no information was found for that internal ID, that field would be empty. So you have to make sure that you select the proper source, otherwise this would not work. Now, another thing that I'm going to change here would be, let me just scroll down, and I'm just going to change this. Instead of setting that as disabled, I'm going to set that as inline. And again, by setting that to inline, it gives me that really nice link, and it doesn't have that grayed out box, which is not really that pretty. So I'm just going to change that, make that modification, upload my script, and let me go ahead and test this if everything is working. And let me just go back to my customer record, refresh this so that we don't get any error messages about anybody modifying the form. So I'm going to click on Save. And there you go. So as you can see, I have my customer name, ABC Marketing, and I also have my sales rep, which is linked to my record. Now let's see what happens if I click on complete process so that I can, you know what, I also need to make our task. So for my task here, let's just say call customer to, I'll just say call customer as a title and just say welcome the new customer to our company. And then for the subject, let's just say welcome to Sweet Dreams Furniture. And just make it quick, I'll just use the same information in the body of the message. And if I click on complete process, you can see here that it just reloaded the same page and practically nothing happened. The reason why it didn't do anything is because, well, we really didn't set any values, or we didn't really process the information on our form. So what we want to do is that we want to capture the information that we are submitting from our form. And here what we need to do is that we need to differentiate between a GET request and a POST request. Why do we need to do that? We need to do that because we need to know if the information is coming from our user event script. Remember, if the information is coming from a user event script, that means that it's being processed via GET. And if I'm submitting my form, meaning I'm clicking on the complete process and then transferring that form information to the server, that means I'm submitting via POST. Okay, so going back to our Suitelet here, and what I want to do is that I want to say that if the information is coming from a GET request, that means that I want to load my form so that the user can type in information on the form. If I am submitting the information via POST, that means I am processing the information in the background and I want to redirect back to my customer record. So what I'm going to do here is that I am going to add in an if statement. So I have my if statement here, and on my if statement, I'm just going to check the kind of request that I'm passing to my Suitelet. So here, I have my request object. So again, that's coming from my context object. And my request has a method property, and that method property would tell you what kind of request you have. So here I'm going to say that if my request method is get, or if the information is coming from my get request, then I want to grab all of my form information. So get all that. Okay, there you go. And then put that inside my if statement. So I'm just going to use the keyboard shortcut Alt up so that I can move everything up. There you go. Okay, so I can move that inside my get statement and scroll down here. So this would now be my else statement. So on my else statement, I know that if it's not a get request, that means that it is a post request. So here, I'll just say else. And then on my else statement, I'm going to use that to process my information. So here, I can just say this would be my post request. And then you can just process that, the way you want to process it. Now, the important thing that you have to do here is that you need to get the information from your form. You're still going to use the request object and also the parameters object. So you're going to do something similar here where you have your request.parameters, but just make sure that instead of getting that from the URL parameter that's coming from the request, you need to get that from your form. So instead of using this ID, SDR underscore customer underscore ID, you're actually going to use this information. For example, if you want to get the name field, which contains your field information, you're going to use this cust page underscore info, which is for my customer info underscore name. Okay, so here, let me just scroll down, go to my else statement. So var, if I need to get my customer ID, I'm just going to say request.parameters. So again, it's the same values where we got our URL parameter from our user event script. But again, we are going to get that from our form. So that's cust page. You know what? What I'm going to do is that I'm just going to copy this so that I don't accidentally mistype anything. Let me just get that ID from our name field. So that copy that and then paste that right over here. Then I'm just going to duplicate that so that I can use that for my other field. So here I have my task title, task, I'll just say TSK title. And then for this one would be my notes, TSK notes. Okay. And then for my title and notes ID, let me just look for that. Let me just copy this. Cust page task title, paste that right over here. Then also do that for my task body. So task notes, copy that, scroll down here and paste it right over here. We can also do that, or we actually also need to do that for our email, but it's pretty much the same concept. So we're going to skip the email part of this, and we're just going to concentrate on creating our task record. In fact, I'm just going to get a pre-created code here so you don't need to see me type, because this is something that you probably have already done. So anyway, so here you can see that I have created a task record, and then for my task record, I have set the company with the customer ID that we've gotten from our record. We also have the title, so I've set that to task title. And then the message of my task would be on my task notes. And of course, to make sure that I have saved that on our record, or I persist the record to the database, I would be using the save method on our record object. Last thing that we're going to do here, and again, we're just skipping the email portion just for the sake of time, because that's something that you might have already done in the past. If you haven't done that in the past, then just go ahead and go to the documentation so that you can see how to send an email using SuiteScript 2.0. Anyway, so what we want to do here is that we want to redirect to a customer record. So we're going to use the redirect module. Okay, so we already have the redirect module loaded. So if I scroll all the way up, you can see that we have loaded that since we have created our initial page. Scroll down here, but instead of redirecting to a SuiteLet, we want to redirect to a record. So I'm going to say redirect to record. And then for my redirect to record, I have several properties that I need to set. First off, I need to set to which type of record I want to redirect to. So type here would be, I have my record type, so record dot type dot customer, because I want to redirect to a customer record. And then I want to redirect to a specific customer. So here I want to say that I want to redirect to my customer ID. So remember, this is 325, which we have seen when we started loading our page. And then lastly here we have a property called isEditMode. So for that isEditMode, it just tells the system do you want to load that as view mode, meaning the customer would just be viewing the information, or do you want to load that in edit mode where the customer can actually, or the user can actually edit the information on the page. So let's say I want to open that in edit mode. This is completely optional. It's really up to you if you want to open this on edit mode or in view mode. So let me upload this and let me go back to my page here. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go back to my record. Oh, looks like I might have closed the wrong window. So let me just open ABC Marketing again. There we go. Click on Save. Then after that, we have our information. So task title. So here, well, let's just say customer onboarding. Then task notes would be, I'll just use the same to make it quicker. Customer onboarding. Oop, accidentally saved it. Force of habit. So for the title, yeah, it doesn't really matter here because we're not really sending an email. And then click on complete process, and if everything is okay, we should be redirected to our customer record. And you can see that we have been redirected to our customer record. And one other thing that should have worked is that if I go to my task record, so if I open my tasks here, sort that via my recently created, you can see here that I have created an onboarding task for my company ABC Marketing. So you can see that this can be effectively used if you want to create a page where you have multiple events or multiple actions that are running that is happening only on one page. Unlike if you have a certain process where they would have to go to a task page to create a task record, and then they have to go to the customer record so that they can send an email, you can actually just create one page that does all of that and makes it easy for your users. So that's it. So that's how you would process the information. Again, if you are going to get the information from your GET request, you have to use the URL parameter that you used from your passing script or from your bookmark if you're opening that as a link. So here you have that. And then also you have here a call to the same request object and parameters object, but this time if it's being submitted as a post request, you have to make sure you get the ID of your field. So for example, if you're getting that from say a task field, you have to make sure you get this ID instead. So that's how you would create a form page, and that's how you would pass information to a SuiteLet and use that information for processing. One last thing before we wrap this module up is that we need to understand how we can add client-side scripts to SuiteLets. Why is this important? Same thing with a user event script. There are some instances where you want to add additional validation on fields, or you want to automate certain processes while the user is typing information on the form. So to do this, it's very simple. All you need to do is just create a client-side script. And then after you've created a client-side script, you don't need to create a script record, but all you need to do is just upload that information to the file cabinet. And once you have that on the file cabinet, go to your SuiteLit and set the value for the client script module path. So again, that's client script module path, and then put in the path on where that client-side script is located. So in this example, I have uploaded a script to the file cabinet under the SuiteScripts folder. And you can see I have SuiteScripts / and then I have the name of my script file. So that's how you would attach a client-side script. And once you set this on your SuiteLit, and again, all you need to do is just create the script, upload that to the file cabinet, and set that on your SuiteLit. So that's about it for this module. A few things to remember before you go to your exercise. Remember the different page component options. So there are a lot of things that you can do on your page, such as adding fields, changing how your field displays, or changing how your field behaves, maybe making that mandatory or optional. Or you can also rearrange the page depending on the layout option that you have gotten. Also, if you are getting the data from the URL, say if you're opening something from a bookmark, or if you're passing information from another script, remember that that is passing the information as a GET request. If you are submitting a form, for example, you already have created your SuiteLit and you're clicking on the Submit button, that would be passing the information as post. So remember to get the proper IDs for your post request. So that's about it for this module. It's time for you to do our exercises. So in this module, you have two exercises. One exercise is to complete the employee onboarding process, which is very similar to what I've done. And then the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to add a client-side notification to your SuiteLit. So that's it, and go ahead and do the exercise.